Hello and thanks for joining me for some more landscape photography. At long last, I'm really sorry, but I've done absolutely nothing over the last 6 weeks. I did go with my mates from the pubcast on our long weekend in the lakes. I didn't make it in time to meet up with them on the Friday, which was the only day when there was any decent light to be had. They all made it to the top of King's How and made some absolutely fabulous images, so make sure you check those out on social media. I must admit I was gutted not to get there in time. The rest of the weekend was forecast for rain, and as soon as we crawled out the tents on the Saturday morning, sure enough it started. It was set in for the weekend and I just didn't feel like it, so I cut my losses and went home. And I'd had every intention of making some videos of the weekend, so sorry about that. Normally about this time on my videos I show you photographs from recent dog walking trips, and whilst the dog walking obviously goes on, there's been nothing to share. I haven't even bothered getting my camera out the bag. I'm kind of not really interested in taking images just for the sake of it, and I'm not going to do it just because people think, oh, you haven't shared any photography lately. I'd rather keep my powder dry until A, I'm feeling it, and B, the conditions are working for me. And with all of that in mind, last weekend I decided, because it was supposed to be some really nice light on the cards, I headed down to the lovely Snowdonia village of Beddgelert, and it's becoming an area that I'm gravitating towards. I'm spending a lot of my time in that neck of the woods rather than up at the Ogwen Valley or other areas of the park, but I'm quite enjoying getting really familiar with it, and that really does help with landscape photography to really know your patch. Anyway, one thing to say before we crack on with the visit to Beddgelert is that I was really struggling with the audio, so in parts it's quite crackly, and frankly I wouldn't be at all surprised if you get fed up and go watch something else, so let me apologise in advance for that. Now I'm just south of the lovely little Snowdonia village of Beddgelert, and I'm alongside Aberglaslyn, a river named after my favourite beer, by the way, from the Purple Moose Brewery. This is the top end of what's called the Pass of Aberglaslyn, where the river cuts down through the southern massif of the Snowdonia northern ranges and then sweeps down across the floodplain to the sea at Porthmadog. Now it's around about noon and there's almost no light at all. It's really gloomy, which is a pity, because the reason I came here today when I left home was that it was a really nice sunny day, plenty of clouds scudding through for some interest in the sky, but most importantly some light for these last vestiges of autumn colour. So I don't know whether or not the clouds are going to break up later, because according to the weather forecast they're not supposed to be here to start with. Anyway, what I'm going to do is head further down into the narrower part of the gorge where it pushes the banks of the river together, because that's where the cascades are not so much more spectacular, but that it shoehorns the river and means that the sort of compositions that I'm after are more feasible, because further up here it's just a wide open expanse of water, and even with the nice white water and the rapids, still less interesting from a photography composition point of view. Now I'm down at the location that I had in mind. I'd hoped that I'd have it to myself because even in the middle of summer, this spot is usually pretty quiet. You have to walk down the main road from the lay-bys up towards Beddgelert, and a lot of people tend to use the other bank where the path runs along the river from Beddgelert down to the bridge to Nantmore. And I'm about 300 metres upstream of the bridge on the right-hand bank. What I've got here is this nice flat area with lots of beautiful mossy boulders, lovely mature trees, and of course this amazing river with lots of water in it. And my objective is 3 or 4 images, something like that, from this afternoon's shoot. So hopefully I'll have a really enjoyable couple of hours here. Well, as I'm recording this, I've got absolutely no idea or even confidence that you're going to be able to hear me over the colossal noise of this river. I really couldn't get any closer to it if I tried without actually being in it. But I wanted this shot where I'm really low down to this series of cascades, and it's sort of my establishing shot, if you like. I've got the whole of the gorge in it, with big rocks to the left and right of the composition, framing it up, some really nice dead trees and a bit of autumn colour in the background, and then right at the very back is the solid sheer rock wall of the gorge. So it's going to be interesting to see how this turns out, because I've got a big series of rapids right in the middle of the image, and I wanted to shoot it so that the other parts of the water are smoothed slightly. Been experimenting with shutter speeds between a 10th and a 20th of a second, finally settled on a 15th, shooting at 13 millimeters. But that slab of water right in the middle runs the risk of just becoming solid white in the final image. So it's been a balancing act not to lose the texture in it, but to smooth out the other areas of water. Of course, I could exposure blend it, but it would look kind of odd if the rest of the water was smooth and that was sharp. So that doesn't really work as a solution to this quandary that I'm in. But I really like the composition overall, and I like how the whole gorge is nicely framed. I'm absolutely soaked, the water is splashing everywhere. It's been quite an adventure even getting here. I fell on my arse twice, both times carrying a camera on a tripod, so luckily nothing broke apart from my arse is sore and wet. You know, I was saying earlier about having this place to myself. Well, actually, I lied. Just met a lovely lady from Worthing, of all places, long way to come, who was in this exact spot and, just like me, bemoaning the lack of sunlight. It's easier on the exposure, of course, with the highlights on the water, but it's not doing anything for the autumn colours. I really struggled, and this is really only the second image that I've been working on with any confidence. So what I've done is I've got this nice line of rocks, beautiful green mossy rocks, leading down to a larger rock in my mid-ground, looking down the river towards the bridge. It's kind of a classic sort of shot, really, but I do quite like the textures and also the colours. I've got a few dead leaves scattered around. I have had to do a bit of gardening because there were 1 or 2 branches in the way, dead logs in the water, and they were far too big a job to clone out, so I've lugged those out the way. Unlike my earlier image, I'm having less of a problem with shutter speed on this one, and I've slowed it down to 1/4 of a second. What that's allowed me to do is to get some lovely milky swirls in the river, not too much, just a hint, but I'm not struggling with it having a big white highlight in the middle of the image. And what it does is, because the river is going down in steps quite dramatically at this point, by just smoothing it slightly, it sort of emphasizes those just a little bit. Now I think I found my little splash of autumn colour just in time too, because it's almost pitch dark now. Need to be thinking about clocking out. There's a couple of little trees here, plenty of rich golden leaves still on them. Some slightly greener ones at the bottom. But I've got a kind of L-shaped composition with the trees down one side, some nice rocks and some more colour leading out along the bottom of the frame, and then the river in the background. But what I've done with this is I'm shooting with the built-in live ND, 4 stops in this case. I use it if I haven't got my filters handy or if I can't be bothered. I've actually got them with me, but they're some way over there. I dumped my bag and I've just been wandering about all over the place. Anyway, that's not the point. The point is that it's getting me a shutter speed of 1 second, which is doing some lovely things to the river in the background. But I've put my longer lens on, and because it's a pro lens, I can open it up to f2.8. I'm focused on some of these golden leaves in the midground, and it's dropping the background out nicely, so I'm getting the separation that I was hoping that I would have got with some light, directional light on the trees, because the background very often is rock or scrub and isn't as bright as the autumn leaves. So I'm hopeful that I can emulate the effect, and it will be an interesting exercise in post to see what I can do with it. I'm quite happy with the composition. I like that I've got the river kind of running through at a diagonal behind the trees, and the backdrop there's kind of nothing going on. It's all just sort of dead wood and rock and fallen leaves, and so the other side of the river shouldn't be too distracting. Anyway, time for me to head off, and let's go and take a look at this on the computer and see what's what.
Headmaster Staunton entered the name into the ledger in small but precise handwriting, and thus was Matthew's life greatly altered from its previously muddy course.
Okay, well, if you're still with me, let me apologise again for the sound quality in parts there. But let's just take a quick look at that last image to see what I was able to make of it. Okay, so this is the raw file after a very basic treatment. Just a few very minor adjustments, but one thing worth mentioning at this point is that I always reduce the sharpening to 0 in Lightroom. Lightroom defaults to 25, and I hate its algorithm, so always get rid of that before we start. So here we are in Photoshop, and I do most of my processing using layers in Photoshop, as you can probably tell from the right hand panel here. But I do make good use of the Lightroom engine, which of course is the same when you use the camera raw filter on a Photoshop layer. First thing I always do is duplicate the layer, make it a smart object, and my first layer is always my Topaz Denoise AI. Not always necessary, but it doesn't hurt. But it's the only time that I sharpen my images using the built-in sharpening in the Denoise algorithm. The next layer up, as you can see, it's just added a little contrast. That's using Color Efex Pro 4. Now I have a recipe saved into Color Efex Pro 4 where I've combined the polarization filter, bizarrely, because obviously if I'm going to polarize an image, I do it in the field as required, but that filter actually helps to enhance contrast quite nicely, and I've combined it with the Pro Contrast filter. I do adjust them. I don't just use exactly the same settings on every image, but I do use that recipe on pretty much every image. Now the next layer is Viveza 3, where I'm using the fill light filter, but again you can see I've got a layer mask added, and it's only going to put some fill light down in this lower part of the image. You can see it just brightens up those shadows ever so slightly. Next layer up, another color effects layer, and what I'm doing with this is just taking the temperature of the river here down a little. You can see it was looking a bit muddy, and again you can see I've got a layer mask applied to this. Now the next layer up is another Viveza 3 layer, but this is very selective. Rather than using their global adjustment, I'm using the control points on this. So all I've done with this is just added a little bit of extra red channel into these autumn leaves. Let me just quickly show you how that works. Now here we are in Viveza, and I've just got the mask applied at the moment to show you that now I've selected a leaf, and then using the luminance and chrominance, which give you a very specific selection for the exact brightness of the pixels that are underneath the control point and the exact colour of the pixels. And that's why when you look at the mask, it's very, very selective. And as you can see, all I've done with this is drop the brightness very slightly, but I've increased the amount of red channel. Now this doesn't mean I've added any red colour to the image. I've literally just enhanced the channel for the colour that is already in the pixels within the image. If I toggle that on and off, I'm pretty sure that it's barely noticeable, but it does have a purpose. The next layer up is where I've done all of my dodging and burning using camera raw filters. So this is a series of radial gradients, brushes, linear gradients. And what I'm looking to do with this is to increase the brightness and pop of the autumn colours in the image and diminish the background and the bottom under here with these rocks. Now you might ask, why did you put a fill light in? And that's just to even it up a bit before I take the whole lot back down. Now finally, I've gone back to Viveza 3, and that's where I've come up with my final colour settings. More work using the selection tools that I showed you a moment ago, taking this background area down even further, but also improving the saturation and richness of the leaves in the image. And then I used a standard adjustment layer just to bring the exposure up about 1/3 of a stop. And finally, merged everything up onto a flat layer at the top. And on that layer, as you can see, all of this detail in the background that wasn't really doing anything to the image, I've cloned it all out and flattened it all down so that it's not so distracting. Now, I didn't really hold out much hope for this image when I was down by the river, and I was kind of convinced that I wouldn't even be sharing that footage with you. But despite the fact it was quite a lot of work, I'm reasonably happy with how it turned out, and also quite pleased with my other images, which I'll share with you at the end. But I'm going to leave it there for this one. Thank you ever so much for joining me. I really hope you've enjoyed it, and if you have, why not subscribe and join me next time. Cheers.